Well, I did one of these yesterday, and I thought I'd done it almost in a month, and I thought, well, I don't have to do anyone today. But then I realized that, well, it's very dangerous to lose momentum and stuff. I mean, especially if it's habits and it's good habits. Make sure you don't slip on a stone this time. And so I thought, I was on my run here, I'm on a 2-hour workout. I realized, well, I actually should do one. And what's interesting and important to talk about, what's insightful, and thought first thing that came up to my mind was that well, it's more a general aspect of life and how, well, to get anywhere, and so the first topic that popped up into my mind was balance between execution or the action mode sort of in your mind and the contemplative researching part, and how easy it is to be non-optimized in one of them or both of them. And it's very much associated with who you are as a person, how you work, and you can say and also hard to define what is action. Is reading action, is contemplating. I mean, most would not categorize contemplating or thinking deeply about stuff, intellectual stuff, trying to figure out new insights. Strategizing, is that action, or is it just but so it's hard to define, but most people understand what I mean when I say action or execution or sort of contemplative research. Like, for example, in life you could say going to university is more in the studying contemplation mode, and which is a really bad thing in education in general. I mean, I would say that I have more problem with the action mode, general speaking, at least in this part of my life, than the other one. And I would it's my responsibility, but at the same time I would actually blame. You should always take responsibility for yourself, of course, but if I were to blame something, I would blame it on the school, because I think school is the more sort of special, the more you put effort in excellence in school, you realize you're not obliged to develop action-oriented or execution-oriented skills in the same way. I mean, I basically think there should be grades in school for the ability to initiate stuff, take initiative for stuff, and that is not rewarded. I mean, you could do sort of businesses and stuff, and even if I did sort of a business thing in what's called gymnasium, corresponding to high school in Sweden, it was still like, it was not enough to develop enough of executive action-oriented capacities that I would think would be fitting for, because I sort of excelled in school, but I still think like I could have. I do not, in some sense, I would not deserve it, because I mean, it would have been better if I was more skilled in those areas. No, I don't say I'm bad, but we all have our sort of grades on a scale of 1 to 10. I mean, you don't want to be a 6 or 7. You want to be 8, 9, 10, right? And so that's sort of that's a challenge, and I also thought that another thing, because when you're really trying to do something like this, you try to figure out what is most valuable to focus on, what really good ideas. And I thought, what am I missing with just talking about this, like sort of action orientation or studying deeply with stuff. And what is sort of left out but could be connected to this sort of action orientation is courage, which is not rewarded at school in a say as well. So, well, if I should talk about myself, I think I have a quite very uneven when it comes to courage. I would say I'm quite bad in some circumstances, but extremely high on other. Depends on what situation. And it happened to be that the ones that are actually rewarded in school, like for example holding a good speech and stuff like that, those happen to be what what I'm quite good at, and even going outside of what's sort of. Well, speaking about courage, I think it's very interesting because I heard you should have quite many quotes of Peter Thiel, the entrepreneur, and he says that courage is in shorter supply than genius in this world, which made me think, and I'm not sure I totally agree with it, even though I get what I mean. There's more immediate huge damage on our world due to lack of courage, and it's not only lack of courage, it depends on how you define it, but I think it's sort of courage in the sense of daring to say something that people might not agree with, say uncomfortable truths that are stigmatized, and that's that's a huge problem. But it's hard to define it because some people are, well, if you go hardcore, the coward blaming way, you could say, it's such coward that they don't even allow themselves to think the thought that they know are forbidden, the thoughts that are forbidden. And that's that's something that's extremely sort of, because we're wired to be very social, extremely social animals, and all our world is transmitted through words from other people, from what you read, from what you hear when you grow up and stuff like that. So we're extremely social wired. So, and the cost of being sort of people thrown at you in the history of prehistory and evolutionary origins, you could basically die because you get out of the pack, and so that probably explains the social proof bias, the bias of just thinking everything is as consensus. So one word for it, and I think that's the most immediate. In that sense, yeah, courage is very much in more shorter supply than genius in this world. But at the same time, I think that it does happen that I'm sort of impressed by genius ideas, but I usually find it's quite hard to find really smart genius ideas. And I think it's there are people who I really admire who have courage to say things that are, and the earlier you are to say something that is always the classical thing, at least in Sweden I would say, who's very consensus oriented, that everyone is silent sort of when there's a presentation, the sort of authority stands in the sort of a lecture, and some people might not agree, but no one dares to say something. Suddenly one guy or gal say something that's sort of opposed or sort of contemplate, well, is that actually true? And then the whole crowd just, yeah, I also thought about that. And it's so, it's silly, and it's but I'm a very sort of prudent person, so I blame myself to some degree, but it's so deeply wired to not dare to. So the first person doing something is the most. The earlier you say something that it's, in confrontation with what is acceptable, sort of to think or say, that's the most courage. And you can also discuss what's most strategic to say in certain circumstances. Is this the circumstance where you should gamble on saying something, and if not, and how does that affect the ability to influence? It's always the thing about if you're going sort of hardcore in trying to get a new point across that is very as an antithesis to what is acceptable now. Do you go the sort of harsh, just argumentative, or do you go from the stance of sort of, oh, I agree, and sort of then develop? And I think that's, I don't think there's a right answer to that. It might exist a right answer depending on who you're dealing with. But usually I think it's people have different roles to play in that, And I also think you might play different roles depending on where you're in your life, your circumstances. And so it's yeah, because what I'm trying to get across is that the more earlier and the more sort of direct it is, it's more courageous, and the more, but depending on where you are and the circumstances, what is most tactical in getting the point across, or will you just bounce off as something that people will just think is yeah, because the thing is, usually people what's the word in English, Rittergravskrig, I forgot the word, but you know where the valleys in the First World War, it's sort of, you get stuck in the place because you're so confrontative that you there's no ability whatsoever to the person has identified with their opinion, and they are accepted from the beginning that you have that opinion, I have that opinion, we're at war with each other with ideas, and that makes it confrontational in a way that actually diminishes the ability to persuade the other side. Because if you start as sort of friends, or as if, well, I've tried to see, as I don't think there's an answer to when. Again, it depends on the circumstances. It also depends on who you are. We all have different roles to play in that, and I think that's. But it is interesting because I really try to think about. I mean, we don't want to excuse lack of courage, but we also have to recognize there are different sort of tactics in how you confront, let's say, bad ideas. And so, yeah, I guess that's what mainly on my mind today. Yeah, keep this reasonably short one this time.